Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. And we're still on the 19th of March 2007 with the launch of FSOL Digital, looking at a bunch of side project and solo releases. Zeebox, 1984 to 1987, Volume 1. When FutureSoundOfLondon.com launched in 2001, the official store announced several forthcoming releases, including a couple of 2 CD collections of 1980s material, the Stacker Sessions and Zeebox. This official store never fully developed, and with the Isness eventually released through the band's own pseudo-independent sub-label but licensed to Universal, the fully independent shop idea was put on the back burner. Only the oil 12-inch was sold through the store. In the meantime, tracks from both these collections were released by Reflex as Sessions 84 to 88 in early 2003. The launch of FSOL Digital in March 2007 gave Brian the opportunity to put together the full Zeebox set, albeit as 2 download albums rather than a double CD. The release was eagerly awaited, being announced in the 2006 Barcode interview. The description given on the old official store does a better job of describing the music and its origins than I could. Zeebox is a collection of early recordings made by Brian whilst living in Glasgow and Manchester 84 to 87. All recordings were made on a 4-track, then mixed through tape echoes, distorted reverbs and fuzz pedals. Recently rediscovered an old box at the back of the attic, and now all remastered from 1/4-inch reel-to-reel tape. Written and produced by Zeebox, recorded at Bill's Studio and the Sound Correction Facility, Glasgow, Manchester, 1984 to 1987. Credits on Sessions 84 to 88 reveal slight deviations from this, with tracks also recorded at friends' houses and additional material provided by the New Consciousness, the art collective Brian was involved in during the early 80s, which also included Howie B among its members, but for the most part it remains true. Experimental sound art, industrial noise and isolationist ambient music recorded at Brian's dad's home studio in Glasgow and in Brian's own house in the Fallowfield district of Manchester. The tracks are incredibly varied in both sound and structure, with some being little more than brief snippets of television or dialogue, and others being fully fleshed industrial-leaning tracks. The vibe is unsurprisingly very dark, sinister, often quite paranoid, and these sounds are frequently lo-fi. The sound design is remarkable for such DIY music, however, and the set shows off how forward-thinking and experimental Brian's work was from the word go. Many of these tracks foreshadow the 90s IDM movement by up to a decade. There are even snippets of music that found their way onto FSOL records without anybody noticing they are much older. 6 tracks, Piano in Kitchen, Laughing Box, Telephone Dial, Nanoplora, Land of Ash and Ear Out, were released on Sessions 84 to 88, and I've covered them individually there, with the rest previously unheard. The tracklist matches the tracklist given for CD1 of the originally planned 2 CD set. Sadly, no physical release ever came along, although there were plans for a physical single of some Zeebox material on Reflex that never materialised. The cover shows a slightly unsettling painting of what looks like a little girl grinning. No credits are given. Conk 3. The opening track of Zeebox is almost certainly named for the New Consciousness, Brian's art collective in Glasgow. Perhaps 3 members of it were involved in Conk 3? It's a noisy start to the series built around what sounds like a glass bottle and some tables being used as percussion, while other sounds are fed through heavy distortion in the background. Eventually, muffled voices are added to the mix, while the percussion begins to overlap itself, leading to quite the cacophony. It does a good job of setting up the kind of thing one can expect from these early 80s recordings. Mind Proset. After a rather abstract opening, the first Zeebox album heads into comparatively more conventional musical territory with Mind Proset, a track built around stomping industrial drum machine rhythms and buzzing synth lines, over which the usual layer of muffled voices and heavily distorted sounds are layered. Melodically pretty simplistic, it gives the impression of an unstoppable machine marching ever onwards. As for the title, Proset is the name of a medication, but this is unlikely to be referenced here. Either a made-up word or a misspelling of protect would be my guess. Scarsdale Road. Named after a terraced street in the Victoria Park area of Manchester, possibly home of one of Brian's friends, and thus dating the track to one of the later Zeebox sessions, Scarsdale Road is a repetitive piece based around bass and drums that sound like they're looped from a live band performance, although they could easily be Brian's studio gear manipulated to sound like that. It manages to carry quite a groove throughout the lo-fi murk. Interestingly, I used to walk past Scarsdale Road quite regularly when I lived in Manchester. Had I realised I would no doubt have done a bit of FSOL tourism and taken some photos. Are You Gonna Die? The first ambient-leaning track on Zeebox Volume 1, Are You Gonna Die is built around a haunting, overdriven synth melody with heavily mangled field recordings over the top. A bleakly atmospheric piece that suits its title all too well. A noisier, less ambient and much more fleshed out version appears later on the same album as Are You Gonna Die 2? TV Dinner Part 2. With TV Dinner Part 1, an alternate name for Ear Out, one would expect the two tracks to be linked, but they don't sound it. This instead is a fairly abstract, slightly ambient piece with slowed down piano notes, heavily modified metallic noises and some synth screeches. It ends in typical fashion with muffled spoken word. An effective atmospheric interlude. Car Hot Knives. A recording of a car driving up a street through a heavy phaser, followed by what is likely to be the knives used by Brian for his hot knives, possibly tapping milk bottles. Does what it says on the tin. Pepe Da Vinci. One of the longest Zeebox tracks at 5.5 minutes. I remember this being one of the pieces previewed on the official store in 2001 and being the reason I was so excited to hear the full album. It's utterly bonkers, a collection of hyperspeed, complex beat mangling, full-on IDM vibes, with all manner of noises and voices thrown through stomp boxes and plastered on top. A brilliant highlight and a track that really shows off how ahead of his time Brian really was. While a lot of the Zeebox material does fit in quite well with some of the post-industrial cassette scene artists of the time, and indeed some of the bigger names like the Hafler Trio, this really does sound a step ahead of most of his contemporaries. The title might be a reference to abstract expressionist painter Vincent Pepe. Cough. Built around what sounds like a field recording of chirping insects and a loop of someone coughing, Cough is Zeebox in fully abstract mode. The recordings are gradually played with until, as usual, spoken samples begin to overtake, a strangely unsettling piece. The Old Mop in the Garden. A wonderfully literal title for this one, Brian simply documenting his surroundings. Back in industrial territory, the Old Mop in the Garden is built around a distorted rhythm over which the ever-present mangled voices and unidentified distorted sounds are spun and laid. For all the stylistic differences, it's in these recurring weird noises that the links to FSL are most obvious in Zeebox music. Nothing is ever left to simply loop around, with odd textures appearing throughout. An outro section introduces some live metallic percussion. It's a remarkably jaunty piece, at least by Zeebox standards. 7,000 Years. A brief atmospheric ambient piece built around synths, most well known for appearing many years later on Lifeform's album closer Little Brother. It's a lovely little ambient piece in its own right, but also a fascinating document into how Brian and Gaz dug deep into their pasts for sound to use. Wait. A sample of someone saying wait is looped and triggered at random, while some odd sounds are thrown in over the top. Some Zeebox tracks are very literally named. Pots and Pans. Sometimes I wonder if a track-by-track analysis is necessary for every release in the Dougans Cobain catalogue, no more so than here. 13 seconds of pots and pans being hit. Rachel Sex. I have no idea who's talking, it could be an answer phone message, but her voice is layered and distorted into heavy-going paranoid noiseescapes, over which a doomy bass guitar and filtered drum machine march. Zeebox material can be playful, but sometimes it's really sinister, and this one falls very much into the latter camp. Pans and Pots. This time the pots and pans have been reversed. Chick Hosey. Named after New Consciousness member Chick Hosey, this piece features what sounds like a live performance by that group, with drums and bass guitars, over which reversed field recordings and other odd sounds are layered. The reversed recording at the start seems to fall into, I'm sure this is used on an FSOL track, but I can't remember which, territory for a few people. Into the Sun.
Can't see them because they're being thrown right into the sun.
Recorded from the TV or radio, no doubt, although whether the crowd chanting in the background was added later remains unknown. The idea of a crowd cheering on people being thrown into the sun is darkly amusing, quite possibly the intent of this brief snippet. Lights On. One of the jollier Zeebox tracks, a tinny drum machine rhythm bounces along with various bits of musical debris thrown at it, including some quaint keyboard melodies. Crunchy Edit 1. A brilliantly named track, this is indeed very crunchy. Overdriven drum machines give way to slowed down distortion and metallic noises, followed by slowed down fuzzy keyboard melodies. Many twists and turns throughout its short runtime and a track that makes me smile. The opening and closing sections were reworked as part of My Glass Is Here. Bong. What sounds like a TV or radio recording fed through a string of pedals with further reverse sounds on top. Suitably trippy given the name. Clap. It's some clapping. Birds. A recording of some tropical birds. Lights Off. Not actually a slowed down version of Lights On, but stylistically close enough to make me double check. Metallic percussion, layers of odd musical moments thrown on top. Despite certain slowed down sounds giving the track a particularly lo-fi feel, it retains a huge amount of ambience. My Glass Is Here. effectively an alternate version of Crunchy Edit 1 built around the same Crunchy distorted drum machine. Instead of heading off through multiple sections, however, it erodes into a weird slowed piano section. Back Off. A recording of a police radio with crowds behind it, maybe? Disturbing. Are You Gonna Die 2? A much more fully fleshed out version of Are You Gonna Die with added layers of noise and drum machines, taking the haunted ambience of the original and applying it to something much heavier leads to one of the most intense Zeebox tracks, dark and foreboding. Engaged in Violence. The first Zeebox collection's final interlude track, Engaged in Violence, is a loop of a voice saying I wish to speak to all men and women, played 3 times. It comes from Pope John Paul II's speech in Dublin 1979 on the subject of the ongoing troubles in Ireland, the full sentence being, now I wish to speak to all men and women engaged in violence. We are leaving tomorrow. More crunchy drum machine, electronic noise and pulsing synths on this Zeebox track. As with many of the shorter pieces, it feels more like a sketch that could be more heavily developed than a track in its own right, but it's a typically brilliant piece of odd sound design. When Doors Close. A field recording heavy piece, what sounds like closing doors, squeaking footsteps and background noise, overlaid with reverse sound effects and piano strings being bashed. It's a fittingly sinister way to close the first Zeebox collection, and one that suggests maybe we don't want to be around when doors close. Zeebox, 1984 to 1987, Volume 2. Released at the same time as Volume 1 as part of FSOL Digital's launch in March 2007, this second volume was originally planned to be CD2 of the double disc set advertised in 2001. Stylistically, it's all similar stuff to the first volume, recorded over the same era. With fewer tracks, a shorter runtime and fewer overtly noisy pieces, it's potentially more immediately accessible, although musically maybe the weaker of the first 2 volumes with more in the way of odd lo-fi experiments. Only 2 tracks, Well-Meaning and May 2nd, were released on sessions 84 to 88 a few years before. Speaking to Demoisha for his Panda Reviews thread, Brian described the Zeebox project. I had a portable 4-track cassette recorder and some mics. I used to take it everywhere and record on 1 track, room conversations, sewage works, rivers, cars, banging bits of metal in the forest, etc, etc. Later I would bring it all to my father's studio and mix it through his desk and FX, then repiece and overdub to form the Zeebox tracks. Zeebox was about art as sound, music concrete, situationist. In other words, the art and sound reflected the situation environment I was in/at. You can see the Zeebox 4-track on screen. Despite the 2 volumes featuring all tracks as advertised in 2001, the original FSOL digital entry for the album announced this as the second of the 3 volumes in the Zeebox series, suggesting a final collection was still to come. When issued on Bandcamp in 2020, the cover was changed slightly, still containing the overlaid pinhole photographs, but with subtly different text and an abridged title. Arshold. First heard on the FSOL 1995 Essential Mix under the name Transsexual, the charmingly named Arshold opens the second Zeebox volume in suitably weird territory built around seemingly random keyboard playing, slowed down and sped up voices, the usual lo-fi growling noise and metallic sounds. It's Zeebox at its most abstract and heavy-going piece at over 5 minutes. The only sub 10-second track on the second Zeebox collection, is a human voice, probably saying messed around with, sounding almost like a record being scratched. Clut and Handle. The third longest Zeebox track at over 6 minutes in length, Clut and Handle is another heavy-going piece. One of the noisiest on the album, is built around a distorted, thudding sound and incredibly lo-fi background drones, with occasional musical moments coming through. A lot of Zeebox tracks are comparatively easy to put into words, but this defies all description. Genuinely unsettling abstract weirdness at its best. 7 Horns. Just for fun, the different horn notes in this brief interlude are actually heard 10 times rather than 7. Hemp Hill. A cheap drum machine rhythm slows down and speeds up in almost comical fashion throughout this lengthy track. Further rhythmic elements, confusingly out of sync with the drum machine, are added, and a darker atmosphere is added with the inclusion of stark synth notes. An excellent mix of the surreal and sinister. Cathode Tubes. Difficult to comprehend speech put through FX boxes and distorted into oblivion. Paint This Town Red. An uncharacteristically upbeat name for a Zeebox track, Paint This Town Red is effectively 13 seconds of a rock song slowed down. Disturbed Child. Clanging, banging noises are gradually slowed down over 30 seconds, as disturbing as the name suggests. Our Own Generation. The second Zeebox collection begins on a run of some of the project's most abstract tracks, with Our Own Generation the first relatively straightforward number on the album. Built around a steady lo-fi drum machine beat, overlaid with distorted chords and a range of oddly digital sounding sounds and samples, it almost sounds like a proto-humanoid piece in places. I Don't Need Your Gasoline. Weird, even by Zeebox standards, I Don't Need Your Gasoline features metallic banging, sinister whispering, what sounds like a live recording of avant-garde jazz, and random piano notes. There's more than a touch of Nurse with Wound to this track. I'm confused, you see. More strangeness here with muffled kick drums, keyboard noodling and layers of guitar feedback, plus the familiar muffled voices and odd sounds thrown in at random. As with a lot of the second Zeebox album, I'm confused, you see, is Brian working at his most bizarre and abstract, stylistically falling somewhere between amateur free jazz and first generation industrial. Will Be Our Judge. Back to drum machines with Will Be Our Judge, one of Zeebox Volume 2's more easily approachable pieces. Live electric bass, quirky synth melodies and of course spoken word join the track, making it one of the more fun pieces on the album. The bass ties it in with Brian's love of industrial funk, while the layers of sound look forward to Everswell's collage approach. Where Two Railways Cross. One of my favourite Zeebox tracks, Where Two Railways Cross, is built around a mid-tempo drum machine march over which guitar improv, synth sequences and swirling sounds all fight for attention. It is, as usual, pretty dark stuff, but the groove present in the rhythm gives it a memorability not so often found in Zeebox tracks. There's more than a hint of the second half of Spineless Jelly to it. Throwy. Continuing the run of more musically conventional Zeebox pieces, Throwy opens with an extended synth chord which fades out to nothing before a fast-paced drum machine takes over. Usual layers of odd noises, samples, wobbly synths, muffled voices and bass guitar are added to form a wonderful cacophony. Rockenglen Park. Named after Roken Glen Park in southwest Glasgow, this modified and looped field recording taken at said park is no doubt best known for its inclusion in the opening environment of Everswell's Room 208. Another remarkable case of much older material appearing on the band's most famous album, and an example of Brian's situationist approach to the Zeebox project. She. One of two takes of this track, the other appearing under the same name on the third volume of Zeebox. A comparatively simplistic piece built around drum machines and bleepy synth loops, She feels like a halfway point between Brian's earlier influences and his later acid house work as Humanoid. Still Carol. More industrial electronics from Zeebox, Still Carol features the familiar cheap drum machine sounds and chopped up voices, here sitting alongside a growling synth sequence. Yet another dose of murky darkness from Brian's mid-80s project. P-Art Installation, also known as Performance Art Installation. Initially released as Performance Art Installation before being changed to its later abbreviated title, this piece was created for such an installation. Less lo-fi than your typical Zeebox, the track is built around spooky synth lines and sampled, heavily echoed voice samples. The creepy environment and sound design make the piece feel like a prototype FSOL environment. Lunchbox. A brief interlude of mad cut-up percussive noises and screeching and laughing voices. Disturbing. Screech. The title possibly being an attempt to describe the shrill metallic noise run through numerous effects here. Screech is a brief noise interlude that closes with a few piano notes. Lights Repeat 8. After a run of more clear pieces, Lights Repeat 8 takes his second Zeebox album back into weird lo-fi territory once more, built around muffled, slowed down noises, indecipherable voices and wailing synth notes. Little more than a brief experiment, but an enjoyably odd one. Bad Acid. A recording of someone shouting "No, I don't want to die please" before vomiting. Stay safe when tripping, folks. Never Get to America. Fairly minimal Zeebox material here, jangling and gurgling synths with a gradually building drum machine line and whispered vocals. 1 o'clock in the morning, pissed out my face. Built around a loop of someone, possibly Brian given the Scottish accent. Speaking of the title, this is a pretty funny track that throws together distorted drum machines and growling slowed down voices into an utterly bizarre sonic soup. Sewage Works. Another of Brian's early synth experiments, Sewage Works is one of the most melodic Zeebox tracks, built around layers of synth sequences from growling bass to twinkly melodies. This is still Zeebox, however, so the melodies are creepily disjointed, with one speeding up and slowing down numerous times. Nevertheless, it's a textural break from many of the noisier and murkier tracks of Brian recorded under the name. Oh, It's a Girl. A recording of someone giving birth thrown through effects pedals, Oh, It's a Girl is a fittingly bizarre way to end the second Zeebox collection. The seemingly apathetic title always makes me laugh. Part Submerged, 4 forests south of Frome. The first knowledge of Part Submerged was made public in June 2006, described as a solo project of Brian's to be released through his Glitch TV website as a DVD. The Part Submerged microsite read, Part Submerged microsite DVD 0.001, FSOLdigital.com, Part Submerged, 0.0002, a second chance, road hedge, slight movement, headlight, before again then, held. I stared at the screen, not moving or breathing. I thought I wouldn't go back, but I did. I needed to know, just to see, a second look. I need to know if anyone else had been there. It wasn't long after it happened that I took it to the forest. I sat with it for some time before leaving. When I got there it was fine. Again I sat for a while. And then suddenly, one night quite late, I saw someone was there, looking at it like I had been. Part Submerged. DVD 0.009. Approximate running time 190 minutes. 41 song titles. Music performed by Part Submerged. Copyright 2006. A still image motion film. Tree-lined River Productions. There's quite a lot to unpack in there. Firstly, a very early mention of FSOL Digital that seemed to go over everybody's heads at the time. Perhaps we all just thought it was a random bit of nothing if the site didn't exist. There's a wonderfully creepy story which suits the music pretty well. There are a bunch of what look like catalogue numbers suggesting it might have been part of a much larger project. Then there's the runtime, 3 hours and 41 tracks. At this time we didn't know what was to come in 2007, and it seemed like Part Submerged would be a standalone project to appear alongside future FSOL and Amorphous releases, or it could even be Brian going solo as his main focus at this point. Around the same time, a message went out to advertise radio transmissions in the area, broadcasting from 12th of July 2006. Low frequency FM bandwidth transmission. On approach, when tuned to 88.2 FM, you will be able to receive the latest audio delights. Transmission 24 hours daily. Live performance Wednesday, Friday, Sunday between 11 AM and 4 PM. The broadcast apparently included newly discovered archive tracks, plus Part Submerged, Polemical, Heads of Agreement and Zeebox material. What the live performances entailed remains a mystery. Might well have been Brian experimenting with circuit-bent devices. In September, 5 videos were added to Brian's new Stacker Humanoid YouTube channel, featuring footage from the Part Submerged DVD 0.004. The intro is fairly FSOL-ish with Chinese text and odd sampled abstract music. The remaining videos shows what looks like Super 8 footage of forests and rural roads. Brian had moved to Somerset in 2005 and, after setting up his home studio, began to explore the area, taking hours of footage which inspired the new electronic music he was starting to work on. This would form the basis of the Part Submerged project. The first Part Submerged track to be recorded was called Missing Nah, meaning Am I Missing London? Nah, although this wouldn't be released until 2024. The title of the album even comes from a very literal description of the location of Brian's new home, in an old church. This is very much the beginning of a new aesthetic for Brian and indeed FSOL. The lo-fi nature of the videos and the music, combined with the rural setting, complete with bare trees and abandoned forest vistas, gives a creepy, almost hauntological vibe which complements the stark cold sound of the tracks. It's incredibly different to the lush, dense 3D headspace approach of 90s FSOL and the warm psychedelia of Amorphous. Of course, as with many projects from this era, a full DVD release never saw the light of day, although a 12-track album was released on the launch of FSOL Digital in March 2006. The cover states that the album is CD DVD 00.009, suggesting it is the design of the planned full release. Sadly, no physical version has ever come out, and Part Submerged seems to have largely disappeared from the FSOL roster despite a calendar album appearance in 2024. Four Forests is one of a handful of albums not to have been ported over to Bandcamp, meaning the 320 kilobits a second MP3 release on FSOL Digital will likely remain the only available version. As for the music itself, it attracted quite a bit of interest in 2006 due to being the first new overtly electronic music to come from the band, or at least one half of the band, in nearly a decade, and despite its strong differences to FSOL, it was very well received. Largely built around analogue gear, tinny drum machines, droning synths, clattering sounds from FX boxes, the music is minimal, cold sounding and quite eerie. The album was sadly somewhat ignored on release, being overshadowed by 4 FSOL releases and the long-awaited Zeebox records. Had it come out as a standalone release in 2006, it may have fared a lot better. Still, it remains a lovely little work in its own right, and sadly far too short. 12 tracks and only 33 minutes of music, plus 2 other tracks from the videos, Intro and Broken Mind, meaning there are 27 pieces totalling over 2 hours that remain unheard. MP3 tags feature the comment, "Yo people, please don't go sharing this shit, we ain't no corporate giant, tar, yage." Despite no more Parts Submerged records being released, the sounds created here fed into future projects, with spiritual successors existing in the likes of Black Hill Transmitter and Environment 6. Second Glance. A simple analogue synth arpeggio opens Four Forests, backed by eerie synth drones and a tinny sounding drum machine. As with much of the Everswell Digital era side project work, Parts Submerged is an exercise in stylistic and creative experimentation, and as such the track doesn't build to too much. Its purpose is more about creating a particular mood or sound. Occasional drum clatters come in during the second half, alongside some haunting synth pads. It's a wonderful mood piece and sets the tone for the album perfectly. Slight movement. Slight movement includes the slightly noisier end of Parts Submerged, opening with a buzzing synth and throwing in drum machines that clatter through various effects pedals. Layers of eerie synth are added throughout the piece, while the drums grow gradually louder and more chaotic. It's on pieces like this that you can hear the spirit of Zeebox is still very much alive. Road Hedge. More dark electronics from Four Forest. Road Hedge's phase drums often screech into overdriven sound, which combined with almost industrial sounding percussion also makes it feel very much like a slightly cleaned up Zeebox track. Wooden Gauge Part 1. The longest track on Four Forests, Wooden Gauge Part 1 is the first to feature no rhythms. Instead it's built around warm synth pads and a meandering bleeping melody, seemingly playing random notes over the top. The rich analogue sound and unsettling melodies place the piece firmly in the hauntological camp, the sort of thing that could happily have been taken from a Ghostbox album of the era. A Part 2 of Wooden Gauge has never been heard. Opposite Side. Abstract sound design. Reverse samples and unmelodic metallic synth tones sweep across the stereo field, in a track that would probably feel at home on a Pansonic album. The piece returns to the cold, icy feel after the warmer Wooden Gauge Part 1. Naked. A richly melancholic synth piece, Naked is the most beautiful moment on Four Forests and hints at Everswell work in years to come. One of those pieces that ends well before it should. Mind Altered. Mind Altered continues the atmosphere forward rhythm 3 middle section of Four Forests with more abstract sound design, descending synth washes and screaming distortion fed through heavy reverbs. The intensity of the piece once again hints at Brian's noisier past recorded as Zeebox. In the Forest. A very fitting title for a Parts Submerged track. In the Forest is musically slightly atypical, its layers of reverse noise and synth bleeps sounding surprisingly dry on such a reverb heavy album. It sounds much closer to one of Brian's experimental pieces recorded at the same time as Polemical. Held. A metallic drone built from percussive sounds, possibly even guitar strings, sent through resonating filters. Held is a rich, enveloping piece acting as a refreshing change after a run of much starker, more abstract tracks. There is little development over the course of the piece, but as with many of these kinds of tracks, it feels much more like a live improvisation than an intricately sculpted composition. The final 30 seconds feature a hissy, looped field recording. Halle. After a long run of abstract and ambient pieces, Halle brings beats back into Four Forests with a scuzzy IDM vibe, reminiscent of Apex's mid-90s work, complete with a quirky, tense synth chord running throughout. Another track that would easily be welcome at twice the length. First Breath. Taking a break from the dark forest-themed music, First Breath features childlike synth melodies accompanied by a recording of a baby crying and laughing. The title hints that the baby might indeed be one of Brian's children recorded very early on in their life. It's a warm, sentimental sounding piece with a crumbling, saturated texture. Kark. Four Forests closes on the archetypical Parts Submerged track, cold drum machines, dark droning synths, some odd sounds in the background, a general feeling of foreboding, and an overall analogue hauntological sound. One of the best tracks on the album, despite stopping dead mid-bar at the end. Polemical, Handmade devices. In July 2006, when Parts Submerged was believed to be the only new Brian project on the horizon, a number of videos were added to his Stack of Humanoid YouTube channel showcasing his own circuit-bending device, Eddie. This was described on the news page on my fan site as circuit-bent material by Parts Submerged, and indeed Parts Submerged was listed as one of the projects on the Glitch TV website unveiled around the same time. The site offered various circuit-bent toys and cheap instruments for sale, as well as orders for Eddie, Brian's own circuit-bending interface, as well as announcing future releases by artists like Parts Submerged, T-Rec, Unit 24449, or Unit 2449, and Zeebox. Only one of the videos featured music that would go on to be released, with the track being part of Handmade devices, the artist name seemingly changed from Unit 2449 to Polemical for the launch of FSOL Digital. There were undoubtedly hundreds of experimental pieces created while Brian was cross-wiring various bits of kit through Eddie, with only a handful selected for release. Gaz also spoke about the project in the 2006 Barcode interview. I mean, from Brian's point of view, he's been doing this thing called circuit bending, taking old speak and spell machines and old synths and toys with a synthesizer module in them and hacking into them and turning them into synthesizers. Very deep stuff. You'd never find me in there. You'll find me on the corner talking to some people about organic carrot juice. 22 tracks were released as handmade devices, described on FSOL Digital as a result of experiments in circuit bending, this collection of songs and soundscapes was created. All devices were specially altered by FSOL and Glitch TV. The tracks are varied, ranging from typical circuit bent sounding abstract noise pieces to fully rhythmic tracks featuring sounds created by Eddie and even some piano pieces. 4 pieces from the album, Satellite, Contact, Iceum and Moz Sun, were reworked with additional material by Gaz for the FSOL track Globules, released on a giant globular burst of anti-static. Although typically a disparate affair with little in the way of overarching theme or atmosphere, there's more than a little similarity with the lo-fi mood of the part submerged material on several of the tracks, and once again there's some crossover with Zeebox in the overall aesthetic. It's not the kind of record you're going to pop on a regular basis, but there are plenty of great pieces and interesting atmospheric snippets on there, as well as fascinating hints of where FSOL will go in years to come. As with many of the early FSOL digital releases, the album isn't included on the band's Bandcamp page, meaning it can only be purchased in MP3 format through FSOL Digital. The MP3 tags list Brian as the composer and Westbury as the publisher, as well as adding, "Yo people, don't go giving this away, we ain't no corporate giant. Tar, Brian." Moz Sun. Named after Brian's son, Moz, this track is created using the Eddie device. Brian described the process on YouTube. In this example, it is interconnecting the SK1 with the Honer. The SK1's clock is driving the Honer. The SK1 is also being affected by the filters at the top. The result is a beautiful ambient piece based around a pulsing synth loop with various additional circuit bent noises layered on top and an atmospheric bell environment added at the end. It would find wider exposure as part of the FSOL track Globules. A brief 1-minute edit also appears on the FSOL digital mix. An alternate mix appears later on the album as Early Sun. Watery Sec. More typical circuit bent fare here, the name doing the track justice, a selection of watery notes coming from some sequenced synthesizer or other. The added reverb gives the piece a real sense of space and atmosphere, making it the kind of thing you could imagine working as part of a closing environment to an FSOL track. The piece also features on FSOL digital mix, unlisted as part of the outro to Iceum. Matty. One of the more conventional sounding pieces on handmade devices, Matty is built around a loose rolling acoustic drum loop with the circuit bent synth sounds layered over the top. Samples from environments are triggered throughout, alongside occasional synth notes, while the drums themselves are programmed to include numerous fills, making the track feel developed enough to be an FSOL track in its own right. Honer 1. One of 2 tracks to come from this particular circuit bent Honer sound, the other being made formal. Honer 1 is quite a stark, forbidding sounding piece with discordant repetitive synths and crackling background noise. Bats. Texturally quite abstract, built around circuit bent bleeps and glitches, Bats builds into a surprisingly effective atmospheric piece in its own right, additional sounds being included throughout the track, giving it grounding and continuing interest. 15 frames a second. Another of the more developed polemical pieces, 15 frames a second is a chunky breakbeat hip-hop-ish track with a deep groovy bass line. The Eddie sounds appear to be largely textural here. Sadly, the track doesn't really go anywhere, simply running through its loops with various fills, stops and starts. It's one I wish had been taken further and allowed to go into a full 5-minute piece in its own right. Nevertheless, a wonderful, fun track. Early Sun. An alternate mix of Moz Sun, more minimal without the additional atmospheric layers and with the occasional standalone notes being much louder in the mix. Iceum. A beautiful piano piece created using Eddie somewhere along the way. It's possibly better known for appearing as part of the FSOL track Globules, over which guitar, violin and other sounds are added, fleshing it out. The focus on piano melody is a hint at where FSOL would be heading in the coming years. The brief edit on FSOL Digital Mix adds a snippet of Watery Sec at the end. Contact. Another one of the 4 Polemical pieces developed as part of Globules. Contact starts with atmospheric circuit bent synth drones from the opening of that track, before heading into glitchier IDM territory with staggered glassy beats and an eerily childlike melody in the background. The various elements cut in and out frequently, making it one of the more developed sounding tracks on Handmade devices, and one worthy of wider notice. Two Boots Together. By far the longest track on Handmade devices, Two Boots Together is also one of the strangest. Built around a sinister synth loop in no obvious time signature, with lots of sounds thrown in around it, it's a very unsettling piece of music. Some of the odd noises feel like they've come from toys, others cheap synths, others little more than buzzing static. The main melody speeds up and slows down at numerous points, very Zeebox in its style, while the whole thing feels completely off kilter, an enjoyably mad track. Truma. Hi-hat rhythms, bubbling synth sequences, circuit bent noises, all of it seemingly buried under a cloud of itself. A really bizarre track that's almost impossible to describe. Made Formal. A more developed alternate take of Honer 1 featuring additional synth melodies and the occasional jarring blast of noise. Probably the more successful of the two tracks, creating a sinister piece of hauntology by the end. Medium Pull. Full-on abstraction here with numerous glitched electronic noises, percussion samples and other odd noises flying around the stereo field before a muffled beat fades in. An Eastern-sounding bagpipe melody appears seemingly out of the blue, as well as a field recording of Birdsong first heard many years ago on Birdwings. Z 2006. This blast of circuit bent noise is, as its title suggests, very much like an updated version of the old Zeebox sound. Sub-Equal, an abstract soundscape consisting of numerous twangs and beeps, the only FSOL related track I've ever sampled myself, amusingly on an album that would go on to be released by FSOL Digital. At the Beginning. The most abstract polemical track at the beginning is a very quiet piece consisting of layers of white noise with occasional glitched sounds over the top. The kind of thing that only exists in its own right on a genuinely experimental release like this, but could easily form part of an FSOL environment if developed further. Staggered. Layers of tuned noise and scuzzy drum machines form the basis for this piece. The volume and intensity gradually ebb and flow over the course of its 2-minute runtime, giving it an oddly unpredictable feel despite its repetitive nature. Song 7. A really tinny sounding percussion line, layers of distortion, a nostalgic analog synth melody, echoing percussion, circuit bent glitches, none of which bear any obvious relation to each other, all layered on top of one another. Utter madness. SK1 song. A Casio SK1 turned into a skittering insect rhythm punctuated by noisy glitches that eventually managed to become quite melodic. Quite a fun, daft little track. Satellite. More typical circuit bent glassy tones and glitches here on this abstract piece, another that's probably best known for being part of the atmospheric intro section of Globules. Gogs People. Probably the noisiest polemical track, Gogs People is a cacophony of digital distortion and harsh metallic synth tones, circuit bending at its most violent. Formings. Befitting its own experimental fractured nature, Handmade Devices ends on a 30-second piece of very lo-fi burbling glitches that act as no conclusion to the record at all, simply leaving the listener puzzled and curious. Heads of Agreement, the San Monta tapes. One of 3 experimental side projects released on the FSOL Digital launch day, Heads of Agreement was the most mysterious. As with the others, a MySpace page did exist with a couple of clips, but the only information given was the phrase polyrhythmic thought goat on MySpace and the phrase experiments in polyrhythmic on FSOL Digital. What was this project? Brian's? Gaz's? The pair of them? Why was it released in lower bitrate than the other albums? A short while later, it was revealed that the material was actually worked on as part of the Life Forms 5.1 soundtrack for Connecticut, as documented on Stereo Sucks, and partially released as a gigantic globular burst of anti-static. In fact, 6 tracks from the San Monta tapes, Yellow Way, Earth Magnetic, Waves, San Monta, La Vesta and Yucatan, were included as part of the exhibition's soundtrack, as well as Heartsick Chord, a track that would remain unreleased until its appearance as an FSOL piece on Environments 3 in 2010. Indeed, the 5.1 sessions are a great example of how interconnected many of the FSOL digital era projects are, connecting Polemical, Heads of Agreement, Environments 3 and other original FSOL material. In terms of who made it, all we know is Gaz's suggestion that it's much more Brian's work than his. The 2012 relaunch of FSOL Digital allowed for a little more understanding of the project, with the MP3s tagged slow shifting rhythms created by MIDI time shift devices, all tracks recorded live, no overdubs, Yage. This explains a lot, especially the jam-like feel of many tracks. The bulk of the album is heavily percussive, with numerous layers of drums and percussion, along with triggered samples and melodic elements. The reissue also added 2 additional tracks not on the first release, Attacker and Five-Olin Yef. Despite not being made available in 5.1, the tracks all feature exceptional use of the stereo field, which, added to the stark nature of the percussion, makes the album an incredibly spacious sounding experience. Between these tracks are a handful of more ambient pieces, including a couple of melodic moments and some abstract environment-like tracks. The cover, a slightly out of focus, oversaturated photograph with the title hand-scrawled, adds to the rural, lo-fi, DIY feel introduced in the FSOL digital era. I used to hate this album. I couldn't get into it at all, thinking it just sounded like a bunch of random clattering drums for 75 minutes. Thankfully, I took the time to revisit it a few years later and discovered it's a remarkable record with rich atmosphere and so many incredible subtleties, especially in the frequently heartbreaking little melodies that are barely noticeable on first listen. The comparative lack of overtly electronic instrumentation is another bonus. These soundscapes are created using very unconventional sounds, acoustic percussion, xylophones, guitars, string flute and choir samples, and that ties the album in with the rural mood of much of the earlier FSOL digital era. And while the Heads of Agreement name, bizarrely a legal term for a non-binding rough contract, would never reappear, the sounds found on the San Monta tapes would feed into the direction of ongoing side projects in the years to come. Sadly, as with many side projects, the album is unavailable on Bandcamp, making it a thoroughly overlooked gem that I'd encourage everyone to try. Yellow Way. One of the pieces developed for the 5.1 Life Forms soundtrack and the longest Heads of Agreement piece, Yellow Way opens the San Monta tapes as the album means to go on. In many ways, the archetypical Heads of Agreement track, a lo-fi synth plays a minor chord at steady intervals throughout, over which are various arpeggiated melodies on xylophones, bells, acoustic guitar and sampled strings. At no point does any particular instrument take the lead, instead the focus is on the hypnotic effect created by so many intertwining aspects playing at once. A wonderfully trippy, melancholic piece. Elongate. A heavily percussive track built around drum slams, tambourine shimmers and tuned metallic hits, Elongate is a punchy piece. As with your average Heads of Agreement track, there's no lead melody, but synth notes are subtly piled up behind the percussion, which, combined with the exceptional use of reverb, add a real sense of atmosphere to Elongate. San Monta. The almost title track of the San Monta tapes and one of the tracks used in the 5.1 Life Forms exhibition soundtrack. Another melancholic piece with emphasis on plucked notes from guitar, acoustic bass and piano. String melodies play a haunting melody in the background, while acoustic percussion taps gently over the top. Further percussion comes in the form of glockenspiel melodies, a beautiful and very mournful piece of music. Antique. Record crackle, trebly percussion and tuned metallic notes are the emphasis for this light-sounding Heads of Agreement track. Occasional piano notes add interest. Earth Magnetic. One of the Heads of Agreement tracks originally created in 5.1 for the Connecticut soundtrack under the name Magnetic Space Earth Magic. After a run of more heavily percussive pieces, Earth Magnetic dials things back to pure ambience built around a repeating acoustic riff and gurgling electronic noises. The electronics themselves are similar to those circuit-bent sounds found on Polemical's material, suggesting that's probably their origin. One of the few Heads of Agreement tracks with a very distinct structure, the electronics become gradually more intense, joined by other instruments, including reversed violin and synth strings. Just after the 3-minute mark, a choir sing a continuously rising note. It's a chilling moment, something one could imagine being used in a folk horror film. After this, the piece is gradually stripped back to nothing, an album highlight. Still Movements. A snaky sounding wooden percussion melody leads this eerie track. It's joined by lolloping drums, bell sounds and strangely filtered synth strings that resemble a mellotron. Analog synths join in the second half. Unlike a lot of the longer Heads of Agreement pieces, I always find this one outstays its welcome a little, the repetitive melody beginning to grate somewhat by the end. La Veste, also known as La Veste du Ombre and La Veste au Ombre. A beautiful and atypically uplifting Heads of Agreement track, La Veste is built around an acoustic guitar melody over which glockenspiel, harmonium and synth melodies are laid. The second half becomes more electronic with layers of synths and flutes and a more melancholic motif. A rich, melodic and textured track, it's probably the most FSOL-like of all the San Monta tapes. Initially tagged as La Veste du Ombre and listed as La Veste au Ombre on the FSOL digital mix, it's generally now known as La Veste. Low Cloud, a somewhat unconventional Heads of Agreement track which, although featuring the plinks and plonks of xylophone notes, is largely focused on rich melodic synth chords played over the top. A refreshingly still sounding piece amidst busy percussive tracks. Bump. After some more ambient pieces, Bump lives up to its title with layers of fast-paced pounding drums. Plucked synth notes and sweeps are featured throughout, but it's very much the percussions track, another that might work better with a couple of minutes chopped off perhaps. Yukashan. Originally one of the 5.1 Kinetica pieces, Yukashan is on the abstract ambient end of the Heads of Agreement material, building around circuit bent sounds, guitar strums, plucked notes and background drones. With little in the way of conventional melody, it's a fairly jarring piece but surprisingly effective at creating a tense atmosphere, and it wouldn't sound out of place on Handmade devices by Polemical. Slow Storm. While there's a general sound to the bulk of Heads of Agreement material, effectively plinky plonky notes and percussion, the San Monta tapes does include a few atypical tracks and Slow Storm is one. Effectively a brief drone track based around extended synth notes and chords, the usual percussion does appear very low in the mix, but the emphasis is very much on the synths. It would fit perfectly as a between track environment on an FSOL album. Northern Desert. Another atypical Heads of Agreement track, it's possible to hear the same creative process behind Northern Desert. There are certainly odd sounds triggered throughout the track, but overall it feels like a brief detour for violin chords. An oddity, but a welcome one. Cold Ground. A return to the heavily percussive approach, Cold Ground is built around sounds from a drum kit, wooden clattering noises and amusingly a Roland drum machine clap sample. It has somewhat of a tribal feel, although wobbling synth notes in the background is a reminder that this is still technically electronic music. Waves. Another track originally mixed in 5.1, Waves opens with a 100-second long field recording of, well, waves. Once the main track starts, it's back into the more spacious, melancholic end of Heads of Agreement, with vibraphone, xylophone and string samples, as well as the cold synth chord from the opening of Yellow Way. A reversed guitar riff, quite possibly Gaz's, takes the focus for the middle, before the piece drifts back to its more sedate side. It's this side of the project that I enjoy the most, and I feel that a slightly shorter album of tracks in this vein could really be up there with the band's best work. Underpass. Another brief interlude away from the album's main sound, Underpass features some strange metallic notes played numerous times and little else. Coasts, also known as Cosat. Punchier drums again for this track, originally released misspelled as Cosat. Metallic, bell-like notes provide atmosphere and melodic textures behind their chunky beats, lending the track a surprisingly haunting feel for something so rhythm-heavy. Tree Bark. With muffled, fast-paced drums, 303 squelches and echoing gurgles, Tree Bark feels slightly out of place on the San Monta tapes, even if the process behind the track's creation was obviously the same. It features quite a menacing vibe. Cow Fixed, as opposed to Cow Brooken, I suppose. More punchy layered drums here, with piano chords and synth sweeps adding interest. A nice atmosphere, but one of a few tracks which suffers a little from a lack of development over its lengthy runtime. Attacker. Attacker was added to the San Monta tapes in its 2012 reissue to coincide with the launch of the vastly updated FSOL digital site. It's effectively an alternate take or remix of Still Movements, complete with that track's snaky percussion melody, only with layers of sinister synths and brass samples added, giving it an even more menacing feel. With a slightly shorter runtime, it's probably the superior of the two. Pushed. The final track on the San Monta tapes, on the album's original 2007 release, Pushed is a particularly odd track, based around a punishingly harsh drum loop that does little other than kick your ears in their faces. 5-Olent Yef. Closing the San Monta tapes, at least since its 2012 reissue, 5-Olent Yef boasts what is probably the weirdest track title in the band's long history. The typical Heads of Agreement drums are present, playing in 3/4 time for once. Metallic clangs and piano notes are the main melodic focus on this unusually intimate sounding piece, the mix making it feel small and closed in somehow. A more suitable album closer than Pushed, the track was likely recorded at the same time as Antique, which shares most its sounds. And on that note, we have finally reached the end of the enormous batch of material released at the launch of FSOL Digital. This and the previous episode probably make the longest combined runtime of 2 consecutive videos in this series, and this is probably the most obscure set of material I've covered to date. Do leave me your thoughts down below. I know some people do really struggle to get into this more experimental material. I'd love to hear from you, and also those who just really embrace this odder side of Brian's work. Also, I hope I've introduced at least a few people to this material who might never have heard it before. Honestly, there's some fantastic tracks in these releases. I would definitely recommend them, especially the 3 2006 recordings for those who like modern abstract experimental music. And of course, Zeebox for the industrial and lo-fi fans. Do leave me a comment down below, I love reading them. Also, like, share, subscribe, any of those things, they all help with my channel, you know the deal by now. Next time I'll be back looking at late 2007 with a bunch of one-off releases and a new From the Archives album. Please do join me then.